the work that I make and to be talking about like trauma that is both like my own and my family and like what happened to my dad and in public, and it's complicated.
Yeah.
And I think I made that decision kind of maybe knowing or having an idea of like what was at stake and feeling prepared for it, but there are moments where I'm like really not. I feel like actually it's sometimes very unbearable.
Yeah. In what ways?
I think like with this work and the work in No Spirit for me specifically, I am dealing with the what Nicole calls the penal matter, or like my dad's case file, right? And in that way, I am one of the few artists in the exhibition that actually talks about the crime that was committed. And I think that opens up this kind of vulnerability, and especially considering like what my dad was convicted for and that he was guilty, and that's like I think besides the point, mm-hmm. right? I feel like I've experienced as an artist and as someone who has tried really hard to like find an equilibrium and a compassion for my dad and his lived experiences that made him do the things he did. Mm-hmm. A kind of peace. But I think other people who view the work, or even maybe institutions like behind the work, or the funders or the people on the board, maybe almost blame me for what my dad did. Like, that's a fear, but I think like there are moments where I feel like sometimes that the shame of my dad's actions and the harm he caused is something I have to carry.
Yeah.
And sometimes that and carrying that in a public way is really hard.
That makes sense. And so your work is very physical and like very laborious. Do you feel like there's a very obvious relationship between your body and your work? Do you feel as though you work out some of that? Or how would you describe your process in relation to the work that you have to do?
Yeah, labor is really important, and embodied labor, like you said, that I think we hold our trauma in our body, and I've found it, particularly through weaving and the loom, like a kind of action and like repetitive work that almost like puts maybe some of the aftershocks of trauma at ease and like kind of calms, or even like, and it calms the mind too, because sometimes your mind can spin in these like loops, right, that come from just like the aftershocks of trauma, and the kind of movements that the weaving requires, or even other work like welding is repetitive, printing is repetitive, like there's like just like these motions, that choreographies that you're going through over and over and over again, and it is soothing in this weird way, and like almost like gives me a detachment from whatever it is that my mind is trying to process or like can't process.
Yeah.
And in a way, like I really deeply feel that my like work is like, if I didn't do it, I would be dead.
Yeah.
That it's healing, but it also is like maybe funneling these feelings that might otherwise be destructive into something that's generative, and something that's creative, something that maybe can like repair the harm.
Thank you for sharing that. And how would you talk about, or how did you get into welding and weaving and even printing? Because it's a very multimodal, multidisciplinary work. What's the history?
Yeah, I've always been curious about process. I had an arts education starting in high school, and I think a very nomadic one. I'm just, I don't know, I move around a lot. And in undergrad, when I was at Parsons, I learned printmaking, and printmaking has always been like an element of my process. I got into like carpentry and welding in some ways because of just life, like the life of being an artist in New York. I like built out an apartment when I was like 24, the first like a loft apartment, and it's like I was like, I want to learn how to do this, and like I just is maybe part of this ethos of like this like DIY ethos of like I want to be independent, I want to be self-sufficient, I want to like at that time I had a lot more time than I had money, right? So I just tried to figure out how to do stuff myself, and it has led me to learn to actually do a lot of the processes that I make. And now that I'm interested in installations, those skills come in handy because I can learn to actually do them.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible that you built out your own loft, and that makes me think about the history of like lofts in New York and how it was always artists who were moving into them and building them out. So I'm just curious to know, who are your artistic influences, and how does it feel to kind of be a part of this legacy of New York artists who are coming in and constructing their own scene, basically building their own worlds?
Yeah, there's so many. I have so many artistic influences, and I don't know. I'm on the spot, so like I'm not sure who I would pick at this moment.
At this top of the head.
I guess I've brought up Deanna Lawson in the past, whose work, like I think I wanted to bring up like marking time artists, but maybe that's a little bit too like small of a circle. But I mean, I saw Jesse Crimes' work like I think way before marking time was even like a plan. I tried to go to Pennsylvania to like see his work. I think it was installed in a barn, and he had worked with quilters out there, but we didn't make it because like it wasn't open that day. But he was on my radar. Just I think there's like some material, like the textile connections and the way it's like archival and personal, and the scale that he works, and I admired that a lot before I was in the show with him. Deanna Lawson is someone I thought about a lot when I was making this work, because of the way she, like her photographs I think are just so moving. Like I'm thinking of the ones like her work as a whole, but I'm thinking specifically about the work, what is it, the Mohawk Correctional Facility? I think it's her cousin, I believe, who has a family member who is incarcerated, and it's just a series of like the snapshots that were taken in the prison visiting room, and it's just like all lined up on the wall, and it's just so like personal and moving, and reflects, I think, something very tangible of like the everyday life of living with incarceration, and I think it is a very powerful body of photo work for that reason. And I know it's also very different than a lot of her other work.
And also feel free to talk more about marking time artists, because that's who we're here with, and it's a community, you know, and you've all been connected through this, not desire, but like the common interest of cultural studies and like mass incarceration.
Yeah. And maybe kind of, I would say that like the work of Justice Arts Coalition, which isn't, they're like an organization, and I know some artists that are part of their network are in the Marking Time show, but I think I have a pen pal through them, through their partner program. Her name is Edie Elena, and she's a trans woman who is in prison in Texas. And I think there's something about like the materiality of the letter and the way like art, it kind of fits into that format, and the way like she is kind of working in these limited resources, and even just like the form of the letter to create this artwork. And I think there's something so beautiful and moving about that mode of exchange, and like the intimacy of it. And yet it's not something that really could even be shown. Like in that situation, it's like an art that is completely between and shared between two people. And I think that in the way that I maybe sometimes want to resist the art world and what it makes us do to present work, maybe seeing artwork kind of in more everyday situations is something I learned from her, and from like, I'd say like the work of organizations like Jack that are really trying to connect people to people in prison who maybe wouldn't have that connection or otherwise.
And what kind of work is the art world trying to make you all do? If you could elaborate on that a bit.
I think the art world, ultimately, even if you're not making market-driven work, even if you're working outside of a commercial gallery sphere, the art world still is working and making people work at a ridiculously fast pace, and demanding artists to do so much without giving them very much in terms of resources to support themselves or their work. And it is a really difficult situation for artists, because you either, for artists who are working outside of traditional spheres of support especially, and in a city like New York, I think it can be really tiring, exhausting, and disheartening. And you have to be, I think, kind of very persistent, very resistant to rejection, and very determined to make it long-term in this environment.
So in regard to persistence and having determination, what kinds of projects have you, or like how have you seen that and how have you experienced that yourself?
That I self-fund a lot of my work. I run a small business and work as a part-time production assistant, and apply to grants constantly. Like, I manage every aspect of my own career, and don't have any market to support it. So like, this is like in a way a product of like, and the support and the opportunities that are available to me, and I'm very lucky to be here and to have this space for free, and that's a huge, just like this incredible gift, but it can sometimes mean fitting yourself into like boxes that don't quite fit. You might not always have the space that you need for your work, and you just have to make it work, or you have to pick up another job or something in order to fund a project, and maybe you make compromises about what that project is just because of lack of funds or lack of time. And it's, I think, a situation where a lot of the time artists have to work within all these different conditions of constraint, and it's a field that is really supporting creativity, right? And like this generative, how do we imagine a world that is different than the one we are now, but then we have to operate within this world, and that can, I think, cause these like tensions and pressures.
Yeah. And so I have two questions. The first would be, it sounds like this is, being an artist, I'm also an artist and I do music and I'm a videographer, photographer. And so it is a very individualistic practice, and like I understand and hear what you're saying with like self-funding and going through those motions. And I'm curious to know how your experience has been with community and artists and finding those networks of support and like what that's looked like for you.
Mm-hmm. It's so important, and like I think, aspects of my studio practice are very solitary. I'm an introvert, and it's like a space that I cherish, the solitude. But I am not an artist. Like, there's so many people who have made it possible for me to have that time and space, including like I moved to New York when I was 17 to go to school, and fell into like a scene then that really opened up this idea for me that I could be an artist, and I still actually kind of work for that artist that kind of was pivotal in that time period. Mm-hmm. And I'd say in the past few years, like I was just at a residency at Recess that was very much about the idea of transformative justice, kind of taking what I learned from my studio practice and the healing that I found in my own like personal world, and like kind of taking it into a collective setting. And one thing that came out of that was a series of workshops with Alex Anderson and the Reentry Theater of Harlem, and the past like 3 weeks I've been doing that, and that has been actually very powerful to actually be in a community of people who have been impacted, who are in reentry, who have been incarcerated, and who want to heal, and who are so open to like what art can offer, and have never touched a loom, and we were like weaving together and had never done that before, and then like coming in and sharing how things shifted for them in that process of just being open to this kind of making, and just the prompt that like this might help you ease the pain in some way. And like that kind of community is important to me, and I think as an artist I am trying to figure out how like the solitary work that I do in the studio, that's very important to me, how it connects to more collaborative and community-driven settings, and like how these two can communicate with one another, and what my work could look like, and whether they're separate, whether they should be closer together. Yeah, and that's maybe where I'm at this moment, thinking about like the future.
It's beautiful. And so I hear you talking about like your own grief and your own inner workings, and sharing your practice and giving others an opportunity to maybe work out their own processes through it. So I'm curious to know, like, what's it like to see that process reflected in other people as you're teaching it to them? And
I guess, I think everybody, or Alex, the director of Reentry Theater, came to weave with me at Recess and had this moment of, he was like, "Rowan, I am healed, you are a healer." And I was like, "What?" I was like, "Alex, I am messed up. Like, I've got a lot of work to do. I'm not healed. How could you, like, you know, it was, and he was like, I think what I learned from him in that moment is that maybe we all can be healers. I know that sounds cheesy, but that sometimes, like, the world requires that of us to hop into that role, and maybe it is just a role, and like we can like transcend ourselves, or like what we think we can do, our expectations of ourselves, what we think we're capable of, and be in that role, and that embracing it is better than trying to reject it, you know?
Wow. Yeah, I definitely resonate with that. And it seems like it's, you know, very much like your practice. It's woven, it's cyclical, it kind of comes in and out. Sometimes we're healers, sometimes we're healing, and sometimes we're both. And so I guess I'm also thinking about, but how would you describe your process of coming to understand, like, your identity as a non-binary person and your queerness, and understanding that through your work, and how do you think it shows up in your work?
Yeah. I weirdly think that No Spirit for me, in a way, maybe I was ready to do that work because sorry. This is not the bathroom. Sorry, the bathroom's over.
No, I was actually looking for the office. I'm so sorry.
This is not the office either.
He told me, the security guard, that this is the office.
This is not the office.
Do you know where the office is then, Michelle?
I think it's on the other side of the
I'm so sorry to disturb your session. I'm so sorry.
Oh.
Sorry. You could do that. That actually hasn't happened before.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I've heard from the other resident that in the summer that can get bad.
Oh.
Because the bathrooms are there and people think they can open all the doors.
No, they shouldn't do that. Maybe we could build you a sign.
Maybe I should have a sign.
Yeah.
Okay, where were we? I should start again. Do you want to ask?
Yes. So how has your work, I guess, helped you process your identity as a non-binary person and your queerness, and how do you think that your queerness is reflected in your work as well?
Yeah. So I think I was ready to start creating No Spirit for me because as I kind of recognize my identity as a non-binary person, I was looking at my childhood and my dad, and I knew what he was arrested and convicted for was a sex crime with boys. And my dad was married to women. He had 3 marriages to women throughout his life. And just kind of wondering what the hell was going on. And that, I think, was one aspect of just wanting to know more of the story. I didn't know my dad's story. And the documents I eventually got from the prosecuting attorney were pretty illuminating. And like in one of the transcripts of that, he didn't know he was being recorded. He says he identifies as gay, right? And I feel in that I recognize that my dad was living a lie. He was never openly who he was. And I feel like a lot of the harm and abuse that he caused must have been related to that. And I think kind of re-narrating my life, where I grew up in, I think from that maybe my family looked like this like middle class white nuclear family in a like suburban community in Florida, and on the inside it was all this like fucking lie, and it was just like trying to fit into this box and like re-narrating kind of my childhood. I'm like, no, my family, like I had a queer family, but it was so shaped by this condition of shame and criminalization that it was not like courage. It was not like, you know, people living out and openly and courageously their truth. It was like the opposite of that. And I think in some way that has helped me, or recognizing that has helped me maybe feel like my place, or that there's a place for my story in a certain context, that there's probably lots, we know that there's lots of people, especially, you know, pre-Stonewall, who may have been or may have identified as gay and were not able to live that life. And so I feel like maybe there's a place in the writing of queer history as we start to write it, where some of those stories can be recognized, and even though they're really kind of sad stories.
Wow. And so in your work, I hear you talking about like creating a world where these people, or where these ideas can have a home, and where these feelings can exist without hindrance. And I'm thinking about, like, you're taking materials from the physical world, and you have these experiences and this knowledge and this education. How do you feel that, or what's it like to bring those documents from your father's cases with your experiences, your thoughts, your memories, and then create bodies of work out of them? What kind of world are you building?
I guess there's part of me that gets actually an immense sense of like pleasure and satisfaction from creating this world. It, like, maybe in some way it gives me a sense of agency over the story, because like the documents I worked with, you know, it's the state's version of the story, and they're only telling, you know, the part of the story that's gonna allow them to convict my dad, right? And looking through those documents, I realized that there's so much of it. It's like, I was like, I know that's that place, or like, I know that, like, I know I can like project myself into the story, or I knew that person, or, and it intersects with memory, and my memory, and the ability to be able to write the story the way I want to be written feels empowering, and that I think is very important. It also feels a bit subversive, that like I, you know, taking on the powers that be in this world is a big task, and it feels like, and as an individual it can feel daunting or impossible, and it gives me maybe the sense of possibility, because I can like change this little thing, and I guess that maybe gives me a sense of hopefulness that with time, with care, that there are other options for people who have done harm, and that prison isn't the only way, and that we can explore those options, and art is a way to explore those options, especially I think in this case where there's nothing at this point that can be done to, like, through the court system, through the legal system, to create justice for me, for what happened to me, or for the injustices and the harshness of the actual criminal justice system. Like, there's no remedy that I feel like I can get through the official channels. And I feel like the remedy that I can find is through art. And it is the only thing I've found that's like alleviated, I think, some of the suffering.
Thank you. Wow.
Like, there's no remedy that I feel like I can get through the official channels. And I feel like the remedy that I can find is through art. And it is the only thing I've found that's like alleviated, I think, some of the suffering.
Thank you. Wow. Do you feel as though, or what do you think about the way in which like unpacking this story and creating this work speaks to the powers that be, speaks to, you know, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, etc., all the oppressive things?
That how does it speak to those things?
Yeah. Or what kind of room for conversation do you think your work creates around those topics?
Yeah. I think maybe, again, it actually comes down to what people, or what meaning people are finding in the case files. Like, I'm representing the case files from my dad's case, and I'm not really offering an interpretation for the viewer. I'm letting them find their own. And I think because of what my dad did, he's almost like the figure of the kind of person that people point at to say prisons should exist. Like, the fact that people like my dad exist in this world and harm people in the way that he did justifies the existence of prisons. And it's really hard, I think, for abolitionists or even people who are more moderate, right? Like, even for reformists, right? To find or generate compassion for people who do certain kinds of things. There are some people still who are considered unredeemable, and I think my dad is one of those people, or occupies that space. And I think there is something really valuable in opening a conversation for how we deal with that kind of violence and harm, and the things that are really, really difficult for us to forgive or find compassion for, that we just want to say whoever does that is inhuman, whoever does that is a monster. But I don't believe everything humans do is human, and we create a tremendous amount of violence, and we have historically, and we're capable of it. And I think if we can recognize that all of us have the capacity to do something really horrible, we can find compassion for people who have, and recognize that we're not different.
Wonderful. Yeah. I think about that a lot myself. You know, it's about choices and the decisions you make on a day-to-day basis, and just I think about what sorts of things guide people to make the choices they do, and how easy it is to make a choice that changes the entire course of your life. So thank you. I really appreciate you, you know, taking the time and talking and just sharing your story, your energy with me, because I understand it's a lot and it's a heavy load to carry. So thank you.